The dirt road turned left, and as he passed a bend in the trees, he saw a weather-beaten white wooden structure that most closely resembled a rural country church, probably a Baptist one. When he saw the sign, he realized that it was her. Thank God Baptist Church. Read one white sign, while another nearby read Putnam County Food Pantry. In the fields surrounding the church, 24 cars and trucks were parked. Pickup trucks from 20 years ago, old models of Fords, Chevrolets, Pontiacs of the 90s, station wagons that have seen better days. The trucks were mostly beds filled with odds and ends and tools. The cars looked as if the original layers of paint had been transformed by dust and dirt into some intermediate shades. The exception was a late-model blue Dodge Grand Caravan parked almost inconspicuously behind the church. 2 boys watered him with a hose, and 2 younger girls rubbed him with rags with foam. He found a parking space, took out his camera, tape recorder, and notebook, and locked the car. It may not have been necessary, but it was a habit. He walked towards the front of the building, drawing curious glances from the men and women, mostly women, queuing outside the door. There were many small children there. Some of them were teenagers, but most of them were young enough to be in diapers or were babies held in their mother's arms. Some of the women weren't so bad, exhausted, too young for him, but not bad. Most of them were older, heavier, and looked tired. He slung the camera on a strap over his shoulder and put the mini recorder in his pocket. "Hi," he said to an elderly man leaning on a cane. "Can I find Mrs. Miller here?" The old man looked at him blankly. "Sorry?" A young boy, who seemed about to turn from a teenager into a young man, because his arms and legs were outgrowing everything else, heard and said, "I'll show you around." "Tommy," the older woman said, giving him a hard look. "Yes, sir, Mrs. Miller is inside. She runs the show here." Then, moving a little closer, the old lady said quietly, "Everyone calls her wheelchair lady or Miss Jessie. She doesn't mind." He pushed the screen door open and stepped inside. The church turned out to be larger than he thought. It was a long rectangular hall. Today it was not a church, there were no pews. Instead, wooden tables had been set up, and about a dozen men and women were milling about at and in front of the tables. The tables were littered with loaves of bread, pastries, canned goods, and some green vegetables that looked like herbs and cabbage. Men and women lined up in front of the tables, again ordinary women, holding paper bags loaded with bread, canned goods, and vegetables. Children begged for special cakes or pies while their mothers tried to send them away. A stooped older man walked up to him, glancing at the camera slung over his shoulder. "Can I help you with anything?" He extended his hand and shook it with the man, saying, "I am Robert Kincaid. I work for the Times-Union, and we contacted Mrs. Miller to come and take some pictures. I'm reporting for our Saturday Florida section about her and her work." Hubert Mossman, Mr. Kincaid. She told a few of us that someone was coming, but she thought it would be some guy named Bass, Harry Bass. Some unusual names. It's not hard to remember. "Yes, sir, Harry does have a catchy name, but he is busy with another task, and I am taking his place." "Glad to see you here, Mr. Kincaid. Jessie, Mrs. Miller, is a good woman, and she deserves a little credit for everything she does." "Well, that's what I'm here for." "Of course. Then let's go. She's in the backyard." Entering through the back door, he found a small room with an open door to the back porch. Next was a Winn-Dixie truck with the back open, revealing boxes of canned goods and containers of bread. A half-dozen young men were carrying boxes and containers out onto the back porch. A woman with golden hair, styled in a high hairstyle and tied in a net, directed the actions of the crew, devastated the truck like a conductor of an orchestra. She sat in a shiny wheelchair, and her head was about the height of his chest. Mossman came up behind her and tapped her on the shoulder. "What do you need, Hubie? We need to get all of this out because Ray from WD just called, and they need their truck in 45 minutes. The guy from the Times-Union is here, Jesse. This guy with the bass, what was his name there? No, he couldn't. They sent another reporter. Well, okay, let him wait. I can't stop right now. He's right here. She touched the armrest of the chair, and it turned smoothly. She had blue eyes, the clearest blue Kincaid had ever seen, except maybe once, and it was a long time ago, so he couldn't be sure. She wasn't wearing any makeup or lipstick. She was wearing a simple blouse and wide trousers that hid her legs, and she was still a beautiful woman. She touched the chair again, and it spun smoothly a foot away from him. She had to raise her head to meet his gaze. She extended her thin hand. Hello, I'm Jesse Miller, and you? Robert Kincaid, Times-Union. I see that you are very busy. Are you sure I won't interfere? She covered his hand with hers, and he felt the strength in it. The hand was not rough. It was a woman's hand, smooth but strong. She didn't wear any rings or nail polish. This lady was very businesslike. You have a job, Mr. Kincaid, and we need advertising. I know your story will focus on me, a lady in a wheelchair riding around Putnam County doing good deeds, but that doesn't matter. If I get publicity, then the work we do gets publicity, and we always need more help, more money, more volunteers. I hope it does you and this place a lot of good, and I'm pretty good at what I do. Then just stay away, don't get run over, and you can talk to whoever you want and take whatever photos you want. I'll talk to you when I have time and things slow down, but it usually doesn't end until the afternoon. There are many people in this county who need help. Quite fair. Do what you do. I'll take pictures and talk to some people. She turned away from him as if he had ceased to exist and returned to her task of organizing food to be brought inside, finding places to store it, answering questions and solving problems that regularly arose. He walked around and photographed people carrying heavy boxes of goods onto the porch and then loading them into smaller boxes to take inside. While they were working, an old van pulled up behind them. A stocky woman, leaning heavily on two sticks, with the help of two young men, limped up the steps and called Jesse Miller. Jess, I have onions, asparagus, and a bunch of tomatoes here. I thought about taking them to the farmer's market, but the Lord put it on my heart to bring them here. Do you need them? Certainly. Do not be silly. Boys, bring a chair here for Miss Olivia and help her grandchildren arrange the vegetables on the tables. As workers helped her grandchildren unload bag after bag of tomatoes, onions, and fresh asparagus from the van, Miller rolled to the edge of the porch and leaned out as far as she could, extending her arms toward the elderly woman. Hug me, Miss Olivia. Pastor Bennings said you haven't been to a Sunday service in over a month. Everything is fine. With the help of her grandchildren, the elderly woman hobbled to the edge of the porch and was almost able to hug the woman in the wheelchair. Tears sparkled in her eyes. I'm just getting old, Jesse, and this old body is letting me down. Soon I will be with Cletus again. Bite your tongue. Woman, Cletus will be waiting for you for a few more years. He still has nothing to do except lie on the clouds and play the harps. He always said that he spent his whole life waiting for you. You have two grandchildren here who need you. You have as much time as the Lord gives. As casually as possible, he raised the camera and took photo after photo of the two women together, catching the tears running down the plump woman's face. These were good photos. The story could well have appeared on the main Sunday page, rather than being stuck inside his publication. Jesse Miller looked back and saw what he was doing, but didn't say anything. He saw that she was a practical woman. She wanted the story and photographs to be seen by as many people as possible. Something happened in the hall, and with a quick goodbye, Miller turned the stroller around with one finger movement and disappeared. Kincaid wondered if there was a V8 engine hidden in it somewhere. Olivia glared at him, and he walked down the porch steps towards her. He walked up to her and extended his hand. She shook it. Miss Olivia, my name is Robert Kincaid. I'm a reporter from the Times-Union. The newspaper sent me to write an article and photograph Miss Miller and her work. You two obviously know each other. Could you talk to me for a minute? Okay, let me get back to this chair. I can't stand for long anymore. When she sat down, he squatted down next to her and took out a voice recorder. It was easier than writing notes in this position. Do you mind if I write this down? Well, why not? I can't say anything about Jessie Miller that I wouldn't mind anyone hearing. Say it for the recorder. My name is, and I'm ready to let you record me. It's legal and I have to do it. I will also need verbal consent, and I have a form you must sign in order to use the photos I just took. I understand. Nowadays, people sue for a variety of reasons. I'm old, but I haven't completely lost my mind yet. After she wrote it down statement into the recorder, he looked back at the hall where Miller had disappeared and asked, "How do you know her?" I didn't know her when she was growing up. She was a city girl growing up in another city. She had always lived in West Putnam, but after an accident and a wheelchair, she began working with churches and the food bank and things like that. When Cletus, my husband, died 8 years ago. She paused and looked at Kincaid. Are you married? Have you ever lost someone? No, ma'am, not married, and the only people I lost were my uncle and stepfather. But that was enough. I wouldn't want to do this again. I understand. Losing people is hard. I lost my dad a long time ago when I was just a little girl, but it's a completely different thing when you lose your husband or wife. You are losing the parents of your children. You lose the person you talk to at night. It's lonelier than you can imagine. Well, it was a bad time. I'd already lost my son, Calvin, and we were raising his 2 sons after his wife, who was such a pathetic woman, became addicted to illegal substances and then simply disappeared. And suddenly it was just me and 2 teenage boys. I'm already old and pretty fat. She stared at the morning sky. Pale white clouds floated, driving autumn care. Taking one's own life is a sin. We Baptists and Catholics disagree on many things, but on this we agree. You cut yourself off from God's grace and condemn yourself and the people you love. But I have to admit, I've been thinking about this. Then Jessie started coming over just to talk. She brought us coffee to drink together while we talked, and cakes and pies. Not that I really needed them, but I almost stopped doing anything, and the boys loved it, and they loved her. You've probably already noticed that she is a very beautiful woman, and they were teenagers. However, she treated them right, didn't hurt their feelings, and they did need their mother's influence. She was silent again for a moment. Then, a few years ago, Clay got mixed up with the wrong crowd and got into trouble in Jacksonville. It would kill me if he went to jail, but Jessie went there and negotiated with some lawyer prosecutor or something to put Clay in a pre-trial detention center, and they sent him here. He did what he had to do, and he's okay now. She shook her head. I know that no one is perfect, and we Baptists do not believe in saints. I know that she must have her shortcomings. I know that she really has no luck with men. I never understood why, but I can tell you that she is a good woman, and there are hundreds of people in this county who would be much worse off if she weren't around. Kincaid spent the next few hours wandering around the church. He took some nice pictures of the kids and made sure to get photo reports for all of them. Nobody objected once they found out he was doing it for an article about the lady in a wheelchair. Hubert Mossman, the man he had met on entering the church, stood outside taking a cigarette break while the line for the tables continued to move. Kincaid noted that people can wait anywhere from half an hour to 45 minutes, but no one leaves. I had no idea there were so many people in Putnam County who were truly poor. I know this isn't the richest county in the area, but today is a good day. There are Saturdays when there are 3 times more people. This doesn't happen often, but there have been days when we couldn't cope and people waited. These are the days that kill Miss Jessie. I think it hurts her more than the people we reject. He took another drag before tossing the cigarette onto the ground and rubbing it with his boot. You received a higher education, right? What about work? What about the apartment? What about insurance? You'd never guess how many people have none of these things, but they have kids, or hospital bills, or parents they're trying to keep alive. There are a few worthless, lazy pieces of crap who take advantage, but most people are just trying to survive. One stroke, one heart attack, one accident, and $1 million hospital bill, and being fired from the pulp and paper mill that employs almost everyone in this county turns your life into a nightmare. I'm one of the lucky ones. I worked in a factory for 38 years, saved a few bucks, and lived well on Social Security and my savings. But every time I come here to volunteer, I get on my knees at night and thank God for my good fortune. Kincaid looked back at the church and asked, "She works here, visiting people, doing God knows what else. What does she do when she's not working?" Mossman grinned at the reporter. "You noticed too, right? She doesn't do anything about herself, but she's still a beauty. I saw pictures of her in her youth, and she was a beautiful woman. But she does almost nothing except work, visit people, and go to church on Sundays. She doesn't really have much time for anything else, and I think she's happy that way. Why? She's not that old. I'm not a chatty old woman, so let's just say she has no luck with men. She was married 4 times. She lost the first one in an accident, which is why she ended up in this chair. She shot the second one herself. He survived, but it kind of ruined their marriage. She tried twice more, but to no avail. I think she just gave up on men. Besides, there are many men who will never be able to pay attention to someone if she is in a wheelchair. It's a pity. Judging by the way you and I look at it, we are men. It really seems like a waste of time, but from her point of view. I mean, she's a cripple from the waist down. What will she get from this?" A late-model Chevrolet pickup pulled into the parking lot, its door opening and closing before the engine died. A tall, dark man with close-cropped hair, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, walked across the parking lot toward the entrance of the church. Mossman's face darkened, and he said to one of the teenagers standing in the doorway, "Tell Miss Jessie." Mossman came out to meet a young man, broad-shouldered, thin-waisted, a good half-foot taller than the old man. "Stop, Jimmy. Turn around. Get out of here before trouble starts." "The trouble has already happened. Old man, get out of my way before I rip your head off." "Don't be stupid, Jimmy. They will call the police, and this time they will produce a warrant for your arrest, and you will leave. You will never see your son. No one is going to keep me away from her or my son. I'm going to try. I don't want to hurt you, but I will." It was stupid, and he knew he would regret it later, but Kincaid stepped between the tall young man and the short older man. "I'm bigger than you, friend. Why don't you leave? I'll throw you to the ground, you annoying asshole. And anyway, who are you?" "Just a guy, but by the time you put me down, there will be a lot of other men here, and you won't be able to handle them all. If you have a problem, there are other ways to deal with it. Go away, Jimmy. It's not too late to stop this before things get ugly." Jessie Miller sat in her wheelchair on the porch behind Kincaid, surrounded by 4 larger, younger men working in the backyard. "You yourself put these damn ideas into her head. She would never have left me if it weren't for you." "I would have left you anyway, Jimmy. Miss Jessie didn't push me to do this. She just helped me understand what I should do." The men on the porch stepped back, and a dark-haired, heavily pregnant young woman stepped forward to the edge of the porch. She was wearing shorts and a loose blouse that bulged out to the limit. She was barefoot, and Kincaid would have thought she was 13 years old if she weren't clearly older. I wonder when she managed to grow so old. Jimmy started to move forward, but stopped. "I haven't had a drink in 3 weeks, baby. Even when I was dying from a hangover, I was dry. I am sorry. I know I was being stupid. I would never have touched you if I didn't drink. But I will never drink again. I promise you. I will never touch you again unless you want me to." She shook her head. "You already promised me. I can't trust you anymore. It was one thing when it was just you and me. I could deal with you being so insanely jealous and touching me when you drink. But you could have killed our child, Jimmy. You could have killed your son, and you could spend the rest of your life saying you're sorry and it wouldn't matter. Jimmy looked at his shoes. Not a sound was heard. I love you, Alyssa, always loved, and I always will. I can't live without you, without my son. If you do this, I will die. Please give me one more chance. A long silence followed. I'm really sorry, Jimmy. He looked down, and when he looked up at her, Kincaid saw that they were filled with tears. Something had changed, and Kincaid felt it. It was the look of defeat. It was all over, and when the man showed it, he either walked away or came back shooting. Jimmy turned and walked towards his truck. Kincaid felt something behind him and turned to see four men lifting a wheelchair and lowering her down the steps. A moment later, she was rolling past him towards the retreating figure. No one was following her, but Kincaid was behind her. She may be a saint, but Jimmy is a person who has just lost hope, and people like that are dangerous. Kincaid had already approached the truck when she got within a foot. Jimmy stopped for a second. He opened the truck door and slipped inside without looking at her. She rose up in the chair, pushing herself with her hands, and managed to touch his hand. Kincaid found himself next to her, not knowing what he could do, but moving behind her. Jimmy, listen to me. For what? You ruined my life with your damn interference. Everyone thinks you're some kind of saint. You're just a damn old bitter woman. You can't have a man in your life, so you interfere in other people's lives. But Kincaid noticed that he didn't shake her hand off. Jimmy, I was married to a man like you. He thought he could stop drinking, and he did this after he committed suicide and left me paralyzed for life. I know how hard it is to stop, but it can be done. People do this every day. Finally, he turned and looked at her. What's the difference? You heard her. We're done. She will not come back to me and will keep me away from my son. I heard something completely different, Jimmy. That's not what she says. She doesn't trust you. She doesn't believe you want to stop bad enough. And she doesn't trust you to be there for your child if you continue drinking. I don't blame her. I wouldn't trust you to be around the child either. The way you are now. What should I do? How can I get her to trust me again? Prove her that she is wrong. You're trying to do it yourself. Join Alcoholics Anonymous. Find people who will help you and live 3 months without drinking, or 6 months, or a year. That's all you need. I will miss my son's life. I know that she will allow you to be present at the birth. She's already talked about letting you visit him with your mother. It will be supervised, but you will see him. And if you're worried about that, she won't date anyone else. The girl loves you. It's hard for me to understand after what you did, but she loves you. Now everything depends on you. You can go get drunk or call Bill Sorrells from the county. He's been clean for 10 years, and you haven't done anything that he hasn't made worse. Go talk to him. He sat with his hands on the steering wheel. Do you really think she will wait for me? I think so, Jimmy, but even if she doesn't, you're not really doing it for her. You're doing it for your son and for yourself. Whatever happens now will pass, but you will have to live with yourself for a long time. She sank heavily into the chair, and it hummed. A moment later, Jimmy and his pickup pulled out of the parking lot without turning around. Thank you for your support, Mr. Kincaid. Do you always rush to the defense of maidens, or only cripples? Just instinct. I'm not here because I'm worried about you. In my opinion, you have more masculinity than any guy around. And I'm not here because you're in a wheelchair. I couldn't help it. I was brought up like that. Well, thank you. I wasn't really worried about Jimmy. He is a good boy. I've known him from the cradle. He grew up. I know. Unfortunately, they don't stay in diapers, but I think he'll be fine. He wants to get Alyssa sober, and Sorrel will be a good mentor. And now I have to go back, because we still have a lot of people to feed. If you don't want to, you don't have to stay any longer. I know you have pictures and you've talked to people. We can do this over the phone, right? We could, but today is Saturday and I'm in no hurry. I don't mind staying here until you're free. I can't. I will take risks. You're a pit bull. You're a good reporter, aren't you? I'm fine. He followed her into the church and saw three men lift her back onto the porch. She went back to work, and the hours passed as she kept the food flowing and talked to people. Even though it was October, it was hot, and he felt himself sweating. After a while, it became quite natural to put down the camera and notepad and take a seat at the tables, handing out food while the endless line continued to pass. She positioned herself at the very end and was able to help hand out cakes to the children. She looked at him and smiled. Even with her hair tied up in a bun, her face flushed from the heat and sweat streaming down her cheeks, she was beautiful. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the line finally dried up, cars and trucks magically disappearing from the field surrounding the church. The women sat on chairs at the tables, and the men leaned against the wall. Hubie went outside again to smoke, and was joined by two older men. Kincaid walked up to Jesse. "Is now a good time?" "You were a good guy, Kincaid." "Let me finish. Get the guys ready so everything can go back to normal, and get the benches back for tomorrow. Half an hour, okay?" "Certainly." At that moment, a black woman with white hair and what could only be called granny glasses limped up to her. Of course, Ethel. The old black woman leaned over and whispered in her ear. "How long?" "2 days have already passed. Sarah told me today that it's been 2 days since she heard from her, and I checked everything. No one ever heard from her again." Jesse seemed to be looking off into the distance. "I'll go check on her, Ethel, and let you know. Mr. Kincaid, I'm really sorry, but something has come up and I might be late. I can't ask you to stay here for so long. I promise I'll call. Just give me the number." "It's not too late, Miss Miller. If you have an errand, I can wait here or meet you later." "That doesn't make any sense, Mr. Kincaid. I don't know how long I'll be here, and I assume you didn't intend to stay in town overnight." "I'm sorry, Miss Miller, but I wouldn't tell you how to run a food bank or any of the other jobs you do here. A face-to-face meeting, especially for a story like this, is always better than a phone interview. I'm just trying to do my job. I'm really not worried about the time." She just looked at him for a long time. He couldn't read her expression. "You were really hard to shake, weren't you?" "I'm working, and yes, it excites me." "Okay, take your car. I'll go in my van. You just follow me, and we can go somewhere and talk after." He waited on the road leading from the church, driving far enough that she could easily pass him in her van. It was about 5 in the evening, and shadows appeared in the fading light. He followed her without difficulty. She wasn't racing, but was moving at a good pace. He followed her to where the dirt road turned into a paved 2-lane road, and then, after about 5 miles, widened into a 4-lane highway. The road wound through neighborhoods lined with small shops, and then acres of open woods. After a while, he saw on the left a huge cemetery that seemed to stretch for almost half a mile. She turned at a sign that said Silver Lake Road. A few miles south, she turned onto a 2-lane road with a name he didn't recognize. Then, after another 2 miles, she turned right onto a dirt road that led him into a world of increasingly older, dilapidated wooden houses. Another turn, and they were driving along a dirt road that became narrower and more rutted. Finally, she stopped the wagon 100 feet from a frame house that might have been white 100 years ago. Now he was just dirty. He stopped behind her. The driver's door opened, and the magic chair swiveled around to stand next to the driver's seat. She slid her very beautiful ass from the driver's seat into the chair. "This is a very good installation. Does the county pay you for your work, or do you have your own money?" She looked at him, and he couldn't tell whether she was annoyed or not. Do all reporters really poke their noses into other people's personal affairs like that? That's why they call us reporters. The stroller landed on the ground, and she turned it around. "I don't receive a penny from the county or any government source. I'm an unpaid volunteer, but I have my own money. Are there any other questions? A lot, but they will wait. She rolled forward, and he followed, nearly falling on top of her when she came to an abrupt stop. He walked around her. Oh shit. He looked with her at the crumpled boards and fallen metal bars that must have once been a wheelchair ramp. They served as a support for the ramp and a railing that you could hold on to while going down the steps. The porch rose almost 8 inches above the ground. 4 steps, each only about 3 inches high, stood next to what had once been a ramp, but he would never be able to lift the wheelchair even 3 inches. I told her, she whispered. I had to come and make sure. You didn't know? No, she said quietly, shaking her head. This is an old house. I ordered a ramp to be put there for her and for myself 10 years ago. There was a time when she didn't need it, but as she got older, her legs became weaker. She moved closer. A month ago, I thought he was getting loose. I wanted to call someone and ask him to replace him, but... She rolled forward close enough to the metal railing on the left side, but when she pressed on it, it swayed. I was busy. There was always something to do. But even in this case, I could come for the weekend. I would have seen what was happening. Someone could have accidentally knocked him over, or it could have been children. They've got some evil little bastards here. Whatever it was, I had to do something. This can still be fixed, Kincaid said, climbing onto the first step. Do you want me to knock and see if anyone is here? She's there, inside. A minute later, she said, rise and knock. See if the door is locked. He went up to the porch. The boards underfoot cracked and cracked. He put his hand on the doorknob and turned it. She turned, and when he pushed her, the door swung inward. He looked back at her, sitting in the rapidly gathering darkness. She didn't need to gesture. He stepped inside. It was an old-fashioned living room with a heavy couch against one wall and a coffee table in front of it. There was an old-fashioned, large-screen floor-standing TV in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves, trinkets, and framed photographs. Is there anyone? He waited a few seconds and called again. He looked around, found the switch on the wall near the front door, and turned it on. The hanging lamp flashed. Is there anyone here? He walked to the door at the other end of the room. It was darker here. He felt for the switch again and found it on the left. He stood for a moment, pondering what he had seen. He then walked over to what lay in the center of the room and carefully sat down on the old-fashioned bed. He extended his hand towards the figure lying there. The skin was cool, almost cold, dry and wrinkled, like dry parchment. Her eyes were closed. Her body was dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown. He looked around and saw a jug that might have contained water. Her arms lay at her sides. Her clothes hung loosely on her. There was a body underneath, but it was hard to tell for sure that it was a woman, with feminine curves, if not for the long white hair. The roots had just enough black to hint at what she would have looked like in her youth. He stood up and left the dead woman behind. She was waiting for him at the foot of the porch. He shook his head, and she dropped her head into her hands. Everything looked peaceful. I'm not a doctor, but there is no sign that she was in pain. She could have just fallen asleep. After a long pause, she raised her head and stared at the destroyed gangway. Pathetic son of a bitch. God. She rubbed her forehead. Kincaid walked down the steps and stood next to her. He held out his hands to her. No. You want to see her. There's no way you can drag that wheelchair in there. If you don't want to crawl inside, let me help you. She looked at the floor, then angrily slapped the armrest of her chair. You're a pathetic, damned piece of trash. What good are you when I really need you? She looked at him and held out her hands. Hold it tight. I'm heavier than I look. She caught his eye and said sharply, Don't say that, damn it. Not now. He smiled innocently. I didn't mean to say a word. Put your arms around my neck. As she wrapped her arms around his neck, he slid his left hand under her legs and his right hand under her ass. What are you doing? Otherwise, I won't be able to lift you. Oof. He almost dropped her, but for balance, he put his foot down and caught her, then straightened up, lifting her with him. Oof. Sorry. You took me by surprise. It's dead weight, Kincaid. I can't help you like a normal person would. I just wasn't ready. As you say. Okay. He turned and took a heavy step forward, then took another step and another. When he felt her solid weight on his side, he felt something harder, more metallic. What is this? I am a lonely woman who lives alone. I have a concealed carry permit. No wonder the guys don't hurt you. Not anymore. They walked to the door, and he turned sideways as they entered. He carried her into the bedroom and stopped when she stared at the woman on the bed. Could you just put me on the bed next to her? He knelt down next to the bed and let her slide next to the dead woman. She just sat there for a moment, then reached out and stroked the old woman's hair. She had jet black hair. Martha was almost 60 when I met her. Her husband, Riley, often teased her for dyeing her hair, saying that she was trying to look younger so that all the young girls would not follow him. She immediately answered him, saying that there were many young black and white gentlemen who would be happy to console her if he followed the young woman. They loved each other very much. He lived 5 years after we met. He just fell unconscious one day at work. She never loved another man. She ran her finger over the dead woman's jet black skin. She was my rehabilitation nurse when I first sat in the chair. Not like this, a plain old wheelchair that I had to push with my hands. I didn't know how to go to the bathroom, how to get in and out of the toilet, how to wash my face, things you never think about when you have 2 healthy legs. She didn't look at him, but Kincaid noticed that her eyes were moist. No matter what they say, no one is ever ready for the chair. One day I was young and strong, and the next I was half a woman. People say you should pull yourself together and focus on what you have left, not what you've lost. Stupid bastards. You can't focus on what you have left. All you can think about day and night is what you lost. It took time, months, and she was there for me. I probably could have managed without her, because most people eventually learn to live with a chair, but she was next to me. My parents were still alive then, and I loved them, but she was the only person who mattered. She leaned forward and covered her face with her hands. She was next to me. It was her job, but it was more than her job, and when I decided I wanted to live again, she kept pushing me to do something with my life. The Lord did not save you from this disaster so that you would throw away his gift, sitting in your room, watching TV and getting fat. I told her that I couldn't do anything. I didn't want to do anything. I couldn't do anything. There is not much demand for cheerleaders who perform exercises in a wheelchair. I didn't intend to go to college. All I ever wanted was to get married and raise a few kids and be a mother and a good wife. I would be with a good guy, but after the accident, no children, ever, no husband. But she didn't give up. It didn't happen overnight, but over time I began volunteering in churches, in food pantries, working with pregnant girls who needed mentors. There are always needs for which there is no money. So, little by little, I discovered that there were still things I could do. She lifted her face from her hands and looked at Kincaid. It wasn't me she created this person. She made Lady in a wheelchair. She was my friend and my conscience. We were close. This was when she could still move, when her husband was alive, when her son lived here in the city. Then her friends grew old and died, and her son went to work in another state. She rubbed her lips and tears sparkled in her eyes. She became old and fragile, invisible, like many old people. She wouldn't go to a nursing home, it would kill her. All she wanted was to be remembered by a few people like me, and I forgot about her. I was too busy, and she died alone. People are always busy. She knew what your life was like. She must have understood. She looked Kincaid in the eye and said, "Don't try to make me feel better, Kincaid." She died alone. She pointed to an old-fashioned telephone that sat on a small table at the end of the bed. "Give me the phone to call the funeral home." "And what do you want?" I'm not going to leave her alone. I'll wait here with her until they come for her. I, uh, could you wait outside? I would like to spend a few minutes alone with her. Certainly. He went outside and waited in the growing darkness. He knew that this would not be included in his article. He was a reporter and knew the rules of the game. You owe allegiance to your employer, the newspaper, radio station, or television station that pays you your weekly salary. However, he knew that this had never happened. No one but the two of them would ever share this. There were things too personal, beyond the scope of his duty to the newspaper. About 20 minutes later, he saw lights approaching in the darkness. As the car came closer, he saw that it was not a funeral home, but an ambulance. 3 men came out of it, 2 about his age, pushing a gurney, the third a clean boy. They were wearing county rescue uniforms. "Are you and Mrs. Miller?" asked one of the 2 elderly men, standing on the steps. "She's inside, with the lady." He followed them in. Miller looked at them as they entered the room. Her eyes were clear, her face dry. She cleaned herself up. "Hey, Bob, you guys got here pretty quickly." The older, bald guy who wasn't pushing the gurney said, "When I saw the address and the name, I ran. I'm really sorry to be here." Mrs. Smith was a good woman. Miller just nodded. "How did you get here, Miss Jessie?" asked the young man. "We saw your stroller outside." She pointed at Kincaid. "Mr. Kincaid was kind enough to drop me off." He gave Kincaid a hard look. Bob walked up to the bed. "Now we'll take it upon ourselves. Jessie, you don't have to be here for this. You don't need to watch this. I think just being here has been hard enough for you. Why don't you leave right now? From now on we will take care of her." The men watched as she turned over on the bed and leaned over to gently kiss the old woman on the cheek. "Goodbye, Martha. Go to God." The young man approached her and extended his hands. "Why don't you let me help you, Miss Jessie? This is a great honor for me." She looked past him to Kincaid. "That's very nice of you, Billy, but Mr. Kincaid brought me here. He can carry me back. Besides, Bob and Roy need you for Miss Smith. I would be very grateful if you would take care of her for me. Would you do this?" Billy glared at Kincaid again, and Kincaid felt as if every man in the room could read his thoughts, as if they were imprinted on his forehead. The young man blushed deeply. "Yes, ma'am." As she extended her arms toward him, Kincaid walked around Billy, reached down, grabbed her, and somehow lifted her without grunting from the effort. As he watched her get into the driver's seat of her van, he looked back at the house and said, "Is he an old or young guy? Have I stepped on anyone's toes?" She gave him an irritated look. "He's 25, still a child. He's in love with me. God knows why. I'm almost old enough to be his mother and look exactly like him. No, and you know it. Anyway, if we did anything, he would follow me around like a puppy for the next 6 months, thinking he was in love with me. I do not need it." She was about to close the door when she said, "I keep saying this, but things keep happening. I know you wanted to talk face to face, but the day has passed and I'm tired. Why don't you just call me tomorrow or Sunday is a bad day. I usually go to church. Could you call me on Monday? When was the last time you ate today? I ate some bread. Afternoon cake and egg sponge from Hardee's this morning. It's 6:50 on Saturday evening. Restaurants are open at this time. I know you're tired, but you'll feel better with food inside you, my treat. You are a very good topic for my story. We're going to sell a bunch of newspapers here with your picture on the cover. Let me treat you to dinner. Why am I not angry with you? You're a pit bull. You don't give up. Maybe like attracts like, you're kind of a pit bull yourself. In any case, I smell that I stink. It's hot and I've been sweating all day. I can't go out like this. My clothes stuck to my body. As far as I heard, there are showers in the city." She smiled at him knowingly. "And you'll probably agree to help me shower, just for the sake of your story, right?" I try not to mix business with pleasure. This is business. If I decide I want to ask you out as Robert Kincaid, a civilian, I'll ask you, but not right now. She gave him another searching look. Something seemed to calm her down. Okay, but if I fall asleep in the middle of the interview, it will be your fault. I wouldn't mind putting you to bed. I bet not. She paused, studying him. Okay, follow me. I live 5 miles from here. I won't lose you. Her house was in the middle of a cul-de-sac. They were all one-story stucco houses. She had a pale blue car with a one-car garage. She pressed the garage door opener and pulled inside. He parked the car in the driveway behind her. The garage was wide enough that she could park and still rock the chair around and up the ramp leading to the door. Pressing the remote control opened the door. Enter through the garage. I'm going to close it and you can come over here. He watched as she quickly walked up the ramp and into the house. He was standing in the garage when the garage door closed. He followed her up the ramp into the house. As he stepped inside, the door closed smoothly and silently behind him. He heard a faint click and assumed the door was locking itself. No one will come in here from behind, from above, one night when I'm tired and careless. This is a nice area, but we also have predators here. He walked behind her, noticing the rooms lighting up automatically and the doors that had been closed and locked being unlocked and opened for her. Electrical sensors. This, and motion and sound sensors. They are not that expensive when you live alone and don't have too many parties and entertainment. He approached her from behind as she stood at another closed door on the right. My bedroom and bathroom are here. The closed door to his left swung open. He saw a short corridor and a large room beyond it. Through it, you can get into the office and kitchen. You can watch the news, cable news anyway, or you can have a beer in the kitchen. I always keep a few in the refrigerator. She turned to look at him, as if expecting him to leave before opening the door to her private world. Okay, she was shy, he understood that. You really have everything planned. I don't think it's that cheap. Why don't you just ask me, where do you get the money to be independent and have all the toys like your sparkly chair and all the electrical gizmos here? It can wait, just natural curiosity. When my husband Johnny died in the accident that brought me here, he was a rising star at the paper mill. He left me a life insurance policy for $500,000. Then my father died of a heart attack a year later, and my mother died 2 years later of ovarian cancer. Their net worth after taxes was $2 million. They owned businesses and were careful with their money. Me too, although I don't need it. I gave away a lot of money, but saved enough to live here like this for the rest of my life and never get paid. It gave me the freedom to enjoy my wonderful life. Is this the answer to your questions? Completely go and do your job. I will be here. He entered the door on the left. There was a new refrigerator in the kitchen. There were several dishes next to the sink. The table wasn't dirty, but it wasn't sparkling either. He was old. He tried to feel the person who lived here. He opened the refrigerator door. There was an untouched 6-pack of Bud Light, a half-eaten pizza, and 2 unopened Chinese microwave dinners. It was no different from his own, except for 2 packages of Michelob and a few more uneaten fried chickens, which he eventually threw away. This was not the kitchen of a man who spent a lot of time here, cooked a lot. The office had a modern flat-screen TV, probably 39 inches, on one wall. On the opposite wall was an entertainment center. There were signs, Salvation Army Volunteer 1995, Heart of Putnam County 1997, Next Generation Leaders 2000, and photos. An elderly couple with Jesse Miller standing between them, smiling. Jesse stood in a wedding dress next to a tall, smiling blonde man. More pictures with the same cast, no other men. He returned and took the beer. He'll buy her a 6-pack before they come back. It was a small thing, but it was driven so deeply into his head by his first city editor that he would not allow civilians to pay the bar or dinner bill. It just wasn't done. It was probably stupid. None of the young reporters would do this, and they would laugh at him if they saw him, but that's what he was taught. He walked around. He could have turned on the TV, but it was already past 7 on Saturday, and the local news would have ended. He listened to the sounds outside, to what was there. It was a quiet residential area, no teenagers racing cars, maybe couples on a date, leaving the babysitter with 4 numbers to get to them. Older couples will watch something rented from Blockbuster. Inside, all he could hear was the rhythmic ticking of his grandfather's clock, which stood in the corner a few inches above him. He looked around and noticed something. There was no dust, no clutter, and the few women's magazines on the coffee table did not shine, they looked dull. It hasn't been polished for a very long time. The sofa cushions were thick and plump, no one reclined on them. The room was swept, dusted and cleaned. Someone came every week, that was obvious, but no one lived here. There was a sound in the silence. At first he couldn't figure out what it was. The sound wasn't very loud, just dull. The sound of something hitting something else and another. Similar to the crack of breaking metal almost at the far limit of audibility, he heard a woman screaming and cursing. He walked to her bedroom door and tried to open the lock. He turned around. He was momentarily afraid that she had locked the door, but apparently she had not. But did he want to burst into her bedroom or bathroom without knowing what was going on? He knocked on the door. A minute passed. He stopped breathing and listened. He realized what he heard and drummed harder. "Miss Miller, Jessie, can I come in?" He waited in the silence. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, the cry of a woman. He opened the door and entered. From this corridor, he could see the door to the bathroom. It was closed, but the door to the bedroom remained open. "Miss Jessie, are you okay?" He heard wheezing, inhaling air followed by convulsive exhalations. "Miss Jessie, say something. Are you okay?" "Leave." "I can't, you know. I can't leave you there without knowing what's going on. Do you have your phone with you? Can you call someone if you don't want me to come? Can't you just get the hell out of here? Leave me alone." I can't. Please just call someone so I know I won't leave you there alone with what happened. Go away, Kincaid. Please, please." He took a deep breath, opened the bathroom door, and entered. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The bathroom was huge, as it should be to accommodate a wheelchair, long and wide. She probably tore down the walls to make it bigger. There was a large, wide bathtub in the center of the room. It was ceramic, but glittered with silver and roses. It was filled with some kind of bubble bath because he could still smell it. Now pieces of the stonework and ceiling swayed and floated on the bubbling surface, and a jagged metal structure hung from the ceiling, plunging into the water like the prow of a sunken ship. The next thing he saw was a woman's body lying on the floor next to the bathtub in water, bubbles and ceiling plaster. Her head was facing him, but she was lying face down. The shiny chair that must have been next to the bathtub was pushed back a few feet, as far as it would go in the room. "Where is your cell phone?" Without looking up, she extended her hand towards the bathtub. When everything collapsed, he flew into the water. She raised her head. Wet golden hair spilled over her shoulders. Her eyes were red. "Have you finally seen enough, Kincaid?" He entered the room and found a small dressing room filled with heavy, fluffy towels. He took off the rosy red towel and handed it to her. "Put this on yourself. I'll kneel here, and if you hold tight to my neck, I'll pull you out of here." "No, why don't you just leave? I'll give you the county emergency number so they can get me out." "Yeah, you really want to please Billy." She stared at him. "You can be such an asshole. This is wrong. You got your pictures and most of your story, so you don't have to be charming anymore. You don't have anything that I haven't seen before, and since you got married, you don't have anything that men haven't seen. Do you really want the rescuers to come here and see you like this?" Finally, she took the towel, threw it over herself, and wrapped her arms around his neck. He squatted down and tried to raise his back. He couldn't help but chuckle. She was dead weight, and she was not a fragile little girl. At least pound 150, maybe more. But he got up. The towel fell, but he couldn't do anything about it. He carried her to bed and laid her down as carefully as he could, trying not to look at her body. Because she sat in a wheelchair for so long, she really had a nice ass. He brought a towel, gave it to her, and watched as she spread it to cover her body. Her legs were sticking out. She looked at him, then turned to face the bed, hiccuped, coughed, and cried again. He stood awkwardly, then noticed blood on her left leg below the knee. "Did you cut yourself?" When she didn't answer, he returned to the bathroom, let the tub drain, and found her first aid kit with iodine, antibacterial creams, and a clean washcloth. He cleaned the wound and found that it was a long, although shallow, cut just below the knee, 4 inches. Something metallic and sharp slashed him. He did his best to stop the bleeding, applying iodine and then antibiotics and using 3 bandages to cover the wound. "You didn't even feel it, did you?" Tears continued to flow along with a convulsive gulp of air. Finally, she raised her head and stared at him. "Do you want to write your story on the most terrible day of my life? I know it was hard. You don't know anything, Kincaid." She turned around on the bed and pointed to a large painting on the opposite wall that he hadn't even noticed. He realized what it was when he saw a young woman in a dress lying alone in an open field. There were 2 houses or a house and a farm in the background, but she lay alone. This was Andrew Wyeth's Christina world. He didn't know how anyone could be an educated person in the 21st century and not be familiar with it, but he was surprised to see the reproduction on her wall. "I keep it there to remind myself." Most people who know this story are so sad for the little crippled girl who found herself in the wilderness, alone. What kind of life could she have? And yet I tell myself that I have a shiny chair that will take me anywhere, a van that will go anywhere there are roads, and a house that opens doors for me. I also have friends, and I serve a purpose. She looked up at him, and large tears rolled down her beautiful cheekbones. And then my best friend, the woman who saved my life and gave me this purpose, dies alone, and I didn't know she was dead. I come home to go out to a late dinner with a rather handsome man for the first time in a long time, and as I pull myself out of the bathtub, the lift I've attached to the ceiling gives way, rips off the ceiling, and knocks me to the floor. It's a miracle he didn't fall and kill me. He threw my cell phone off the chair into the water. I always bring it to the bathroom just in case. So if this had happened on any other night, I would have been there alone and unable to call for help. Maybe I could squeeze into a chair. I'm pretty strong, but in slippery bubble bath water, maybe not. Then I would have to drag myself out of this room by my fingernails and drag myself across the tile floor to the home phone by the bed. She looked back at Christina's world. I would crawl like her. Almost a century has passed since her time. I have achieved a lot, but I would still crawl like an animal, like a child who will never learn to walk. She wiped the tears and then the snot from one side of her beautiful face. "You say, Kincaid, you're trying to be kind, but you're not. Nobody, unless he's sitting in a chair, knows what it's like." She took a deep breath. "I sat in this chair 15 years ago and had to learn to live like this. 15 years later, nothing has changed. Away from this chair, away from my car, I'm still half human, and that will never change. In 20 to 30 years, no matter what science fiction writers say, I will still be crawling." She bit her lip and looked into his eyes. "Like Martha, I will grow old, but without a husband, without children. I will have friends, people I helped along the way, but people have their own lives. They won't be cruel. They will try to keep in touch, but they won't. They will leave, and one day someone will come here when they have not heard from me, and they will find me in bed, like Martha." There was a challenge in her gaze. "That's why I'm crying. That's why I won't go anywhere with you. Make me feel better about this day and my miserable life. And if you still want, I can think about dinner later." "Well, I can't give you any deep thoughts or advice." I can only say that although what happened in your bathroom was pretty rough for you, I have to say that it was the highlight of my day for me. You're the hottest thing I've seen this week, maybe this month, maybe longer. She stared at him, then shook her head, but couldn't help but smile. God, men are such pigs. A little boob and ass, and you think the world's problems will take care of themselves. It's simplistic, but it's pretty much true for most guys. She wiped away the remaining tears and wiped her nose with the edge of the towel. Why am I even thinking about this? Like you said, it was a long time ago. She gave him a look that he instinctively recognized. Do you really think I'm hot? I'm 40 years old and getting fat. Even 40 years old and fat, you're pretty hot. I didn't have to turn my head away in disgust. You could have noticed, and you have great legs. She looked down at them. I do exercises every day. I don't want to have dry sticks. But the damage has already been done. I have good legs, but I once had great legs. They're still pretty good. Do you want to go out? Bring my chair here. You can roll it with the controls, and the clothes I'm going to put on are on that chair over there. Put her on the bed, bring her a chair, and then go away and let me be alone for a while. Are you going to call anyone about that little trouble in the bathroom? For what? Who will come out on Saturday night to repair a ceiling that can be done on Monday? I can use a wet sponge until it gets fixed. This won't be the first time. As they drove along Highway 17 toward downtown and the memorial bridge that crosses the St. John's River in East Palatka, Kincaid couldn't comprehend how much the small town had changed in the last 20 years. New businesses sprang up along the arteries feeding the main thoroughfare that turned into Reed Street as it entered the city. As they approached the bridge, Jessie Miller slowed. She turned on her turn signal as they pulled up to a railroad dining car sitting like a beached whale in the middle of the business district with a sign that said, Angel's Dining Car. Looking 2 blocks away at the river, she said, the hottest place for high school kids in 40 years, and they have the best burgers in the world. I heard about it. Even in Jacksonville, we heard about Angel. As she pulled into a crowded parking lot on a nearby street, she said, I've always loved this place, but it haunts me. Kincaid looked at her as she turned off the ignition. She was looking towards the river, although she was not visible because of the buildings standing between them. I was a graduate that year. I was here with a bunch of my friends from the cheerleading squad, guys from the football team, and a bunch of my other friends, partying. It was Friday evening, and then we heard it was the end of the world. She sat motionless. It sounded like a nuclear explosion should have sounded. The building actually shook. There was a Coca-Cola in one of those old-fashioned cups on the counter in front of me, and it was wobbly. We ran out. It was visible from the road, just across the river. It was a huge fuel tanker. Today, I don't think they'll even let him cross the bridge. It actually damaged the foundation of the bridge on that side. The explosion was so strong that one of the statues of World War I soldiers that stood at the entrance to this side of the bridge received some damage. She had a blank expression on her face, as if she had actually been back there for a moment. There was a strong wind. In fact, a thunderstorm was preparing to break through the city, and things garbage, like confetti, paper, fabric, etc., were actually swirling in the wind. I stood there on the street. In fact, I stood with one foot on the road and the other on the sidewalk. All movement stopped. Something was floating on the wind. I thought it was raining, but when it came at me, I just reached out and grabbed it. She was as light as silk because it was silk. It was a piece of silk handkerchief. I looked at him and didn't understand what I was seeing, but I saw 2 letters embroidered in silver on red fabric E. Then I had no idea what these letters meant and who the scarf belonged to. We found out about it the next week. They belonged to a woman named Eliza Abbott. She was married to local newspaper reporter Clint Abbott. She cheated on him with one of his coaches in high school. She was walking with her boyfriend when they blew themselves up after crashing into a gas station. Of course, we didn't know about it then. Little by little, it came to light. People gossiped about it. But no one wanted to talk about it much because of her husband. She pulled the key out of the ignition and opened the door as the stroller slid into place. I still have the scarf. They found some documents downriver that proved the woman in the truck with the guy was Abbott's wife. But that bothered me. One day I went there, and he was at the Daily News office. I asked permission to talk to him, and he came to me. He asked what I needed, and I answered that I was with Angel the night of the explosion. I told him about the piece of handkerchief that fell from the sky and gave it to him. She slid from the driver's seat into the seat, which lowered as Kincaid walked around the car. That's what I think about on those days when I start to feel sorry for myself. I think about this stupid woman and the husband she left behind. She will never see the sunrise again. I will see. Like I said, it helps me focus on what's important. He followed her to the back of the dining car, where he saw a ramp had been installed. Of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act had its impact. Several people said hello or touched her shoulder as she walked by. When they entered the diner, there was a door at one end of the counter where the cooks and waitresses came and went. 4 teenagers sat at the table closest to the door. There was no way the chair could get through the narrow passage between the counter and the tables to the other tables. They were all packed. The glance the bald man holding a spatula on the grill gave to the teenagers caused them to hastily stand up and head downstairs to find any open seats further down. Jessie turned her chair sideways to sit at the table. "What would you like? I'll treat you." "What did you want?" she asked, and then said to the young waitress, "Signature dinner with fatty fries and cherry Coke." "Same thing," Kincaid said when the waitress looked his way. The diner's signature dish, when it arrived, was a thick double hamburger on a buttered bun with thick slices of onions, tomatoes, and lettuce. Nothing special, but when he sank his teeth into her, he couldn't believe how good he was. He had forgotten how tasty it could be. She just looked at him as he swallowed a huge piece of fried hamburger and dressing and said, "This is magic." For 10 minutes they hardly spoke. Finally, they both finished. She popped the last of the incredibly salty, crispy, greasy French fries into her mouth and said, "You were right, Kincaid. Thank you. I'm glad you made me come with you. Just call me Good Bully." She leaned back in her chair and said, "I'll try." 45 minutes later, they each ordered their third Coke and sipped it. He turned off the recorder and said, "Thank you for being so frank." "My pleasure. Are you ready to go? Is it really that hard to talk to me? You said it was a business." "It was a business. Nothing says we can't talk for a while." She glanced at the huge glass-faced clock high above the counter. The clock showed 10:30 p.m. Now is the witching hour. I turn into a very ugly witch when the clock strikes midnight. Okay, I'll pay the bill and... You don't understand jokes, do you? We have some time. What would you like to know, Mr. Kincaid? Why did you shoot your second husband? Oh, have you heard this story? Yes. This attracts interest. Do you still have a weapon with you right now? Yes, in my purse, where I can always get it. As I said, I have a concealed carry permit. What is this story, if you don't mind talking? It's easier for me to tell you the whole story. Do you mind spending a few extra minutes here? Certainly. All this talk has made me hungry. I'll have to diet for the next week. But could you bring me a cup of coffee? Their coffee is also the best in the state, and a piece of cherry pie? He smiled. You want it all, no matter what, don't you? The truth is, I don't have many options, and I'm enjoying this night much more than I ever imagined I would this afternoon. He ordered coffee. I met my husband at school. It was a typical high school love story. I was the main cheerleader. No wonder Johnny, that was his name. Johnny Miller was crazy about me. He was, as you might guess, the Panthers quarterback the year we made it to the state finals. He dreamed of becoming a professional, but we both knew that he would work in a paper mill, and I would get pregnant, give birth to a boy and a girl, and become a housewife. She would put a piece of cherry pie in her mouth, and do almost illegal things with it. Kincaid had to change his position, and he caught the small smirk she gave him. "I'll have to starve myself next week, but it'll be worth it." He really succeeded, and pretty soon he started making good money. I got pregnant but slipped and fell in the grocery store. It was just a slip and fall, but I lost the baby. We couldn't sue. His uncle was a manager and would have lost his job. In any case, no one is to blame, so we kept trying, but nothing worked. Johnny was a great guy, but he started drinking when he was 14, and it got worse and worse as he got older. He never touched me while he was drinking. He wasn't a bad drunk and always managed to get to work, but there were weekends when he just couldn't get out of bed or off the floor, wherever he landed. Then there was a party on Friday night where they were going to announce his promotion, and he started drinking that morning. On the way to the Civic Center at Azalea Gardens, he veered off the center line and crashed into a Budweiser delivery truck. It was like the worst joke ever. I was next to him when it happened. Kincaid found himself reaching out his hand. "I'm really sorry. That was a lifetime ago. Sometimes I have to look at our wedding photo to remember what he looked like." She shook her head and said, "Anyway, it was a long time ago." After Johnny died, as I said, I met Martha and eventually decided I wanted to move on with my life and started doing some volunteer work. About 2 years after Johnny died, I remembered that I was a woman, and some guys still acted like I looked decent. I let a few friends set me up on a few dates. I'm not going to tell you that it wasn't weird at first. I didn't know what to expect or how to behave. For some reason, I felt like I was cheating the guy because he was only getting half the package. There were a few times when I did things that I regretted, just trying to compensate for being in the chair. Then a friend introduced me to Lance. This was his real name, Lance, and he was like a breath of fresh air. He kissed my hand when introduced and brought flowers to every date. He would sometimes call me in the evening when we didn't have a date because he just liked the sound of my voice. It was quite overwhelming. But he was very jealous. I know, I should have suspected something, but I felt like a piece of crap for so long, a freak, that when a man treats me like that, I feel good, I feel safe, I feel wanted. Kincaid nodded. "Yes, I understand. So, you know what happened next? He beat me. I called Martha at the hospital. She came and picked me up. There was a deputy there and Lance couldn't do anything. Later in the evening, he drove to Martha's house. Riley came out with a loaded shotgun and told Lance that if he didn't leave in 30 seconds, he wouldn't be alive to regret his stupidity. Lance left, but he continued to call me and apologize for his crazy jealousy. After a while, he wore me down. I didn't want to be alone again. I went back to him, but Martha made me buy a special .38 caliber pistol and get a gun permit before I went back to him. On the first evening, when I returned to him, he entered before me and, saying that he loved me, hit me. He ran away. That's the only thing that saved his life. I shot at him while running, but missed. That son of a bitch had the nerve to try and arrest me for assaulting him, but I had the doctor's report and the photographs and the fact that too many people knew what an asshole he really was. The state's attorney gave him the option of waiving the charges and leaving Florida permanently or going to Rayford for 20 years to life in prison for assault and intent to commit murder. He decided to leave. It was good for him because I would have killed him if I saw him in the next few months. "I think you would," Kincaid finally said. Silence still surrounded them. "I would do so. That's my whole story. I was married to an alcoholic and then to a rapist. You've had bad luck with men more than once. You haven't heard half of it." When they left the van, she drove onto Reed Street and headed towards the river. The parking lot is a popular place for teenagers to make out these days, but it's pretty cute. If you want to talk a little more, let's go there. Certainly. There were a lot of cars, but there were also a few empty seats. They pulled into one, and she turned off the engine. The heavy, swollen moon seemed to hang directly above the black bulk of the St. John's River. Hubie told me you've been married 4 times. It was hard to believe. What happened after Lance? I was quite timid, but you never stop being a woman. Am I shocking you? I've been married and divorced and slept with several women. Long story short, I was afraid of getting burned again, no pun intended, but little by little I started dating again. A couple of years later I met Troy. He seemed like a nice, normal guy. He took me out to eat and we went on a few trips Disneyland, Six Flags, and did a couple of things. He wasn't intrusive and he never touched me unless I wanted him to. She rolled down the windows and the night air was cool, smelling of the river. He heard fish jumping and splashing somewhere, rhythmic female moans, and other sounds of the night. He wanted me. He really wanted me. I know it sounds. I have to admit, after years of being single, it felt good to be some man's fantasy. So I did it again. She stared into the night. You'd think over time I'll learn. For a while everything was fine. Like the old joke, too much sex is a good thing. Still, I should have suspected something was wrong, but I didn't mind it was a fantasy. Unfortunately, he became more and more perverted. She suddenly turned to face him and put her hands on the ignition key. Perhaps this is going too far, Kincaid. I know that I feel that there is some kind of, between us, an undercurrent, unless it's just my fevered imagination. But I tell you things, oh my God, I say things to a strange guy that I wouldn't say to my friends. Somehow you found the key and you're unlocking secrets that I don't want you to know, even if we never do anything. He leaned back in his seat and the moonlight reflected in his eyes. She thought that there was something supernatural in his eyes in the darkness, but then she came to her senses. It was moonlight and she let her imagination run away from her. I told you, Jesse, that I'm a reporter. My job is to get people to trust me and talk, spill their guts. It's just that I'm good at it, and you've had a long, hard day. I took you outside, fed you, made you laugh, and made you feel like a woman. There's nothing complicated about it. He placed his hand on top of hers on the steering wheel, and she thought she could feel his pulse. I enjoy it. It's not a real date, but I'm having fun. I wouldn't have come here so late if the newspaper needed it, or if I didn't enjoy your company. What we are talking about now has nothing to do with a lady in a wheelchair and the Times-Union. It's between Jesse Miller and Robert Kincaid. We can go back to your house, and I'll take my car and go to Jax's, or we can sit here and talk some more. I'd like to know more about you, but you don't have to tell me anything. They sat in silence for some time. He got to the point where fantasies were the only thing that interested him, and they always included me, subordinate him in everything. And then an incident came, after which I never stopped feeling dirty and used. Finally, I understood everything. It took me about 3 months. It was all for him. He didn't really care about me. It was my helplessness, a crippled girlish fantasy that he could force to do whatever he wanted. He needed a victim. I'm not sure he would ever hurt me. But when you're attached, who knows? So, a week later, I threw him out, and that was the end of my 3rd marriage. I am now officially the poster girl for bad marriages. It's not your fault. You know that, right? You're only guilty of attracting perverted men. You don't deserve to be beaten and bullied. They were assholes. I know, but it was the 4th marriage that opened my eyes. I'm almost afraid to ask. Much less dramatic. About 8 years ago, I met Eric. He was an EMT in the area. We worked together a lot, and he volunteered a lot. We often ended up together and ended up in bed. It's okay, it just happened that way. He was smart, kind, easygoing, and loved simple, old-fashioned sex. He was 40 years old and ready for marriage, for stability. He had to persuade me. So we tied the knot, and he moved in with me. 2 years passed, and one evening he just sat down opposite me and said that he wanted a divorce. I asked him why, and he said he was tired. He didn't understand what it meant to be married to a cripple. He didn't use that word, but that's what he meant. He said he never understood that it meant he couldn't imagine being a nanny for the rest of his life. So I let him go, to find a normal life with a woman who could move with him when they had sex, who could walk down the sidewalk holding his hand, who could give him children. I understood him, he was not a bad guy, but it was then that I realized that there would never be anyone for me, not a single man. You're too young and attractive to refuse sex. He saw her white teeth glint in the moonlight as she smiled. Oh, I didn't give up sex. There were guys there that I saw. Right now, I'm meeting with one of the associate deans of St. John's River College when we're free and both in the mood. He is married, so he is not interested in anything permanent. Married? He is a Catholic, a real Catholic. His wife suffered a stroke when she was 37. She has been in a vegetative state in a nursing home for 6 years. She'll never get out, but he can't divorce her, and they have kids, so we help each other. She felt something, but didn't know for sure. So now you know everything about me, but I don't know anything about you. Tell me something intimate about yourself. I told you I was married and divorced. I was married for 5 years. She was a pretty and sweet girl. She worked as a reporter for the newspapers, and we never had much passion, but we loved each other. We loved the same things. We loved newspapers, and we were pretty good in bed together. What's happened? One Sunday morning, we woke up. We didn't go to church. We didn't have children. I don't play golf, and we are not the country club type. We could go to a garage sale or go out to dinner. We had a large double bed. She was on her side, and I was on mine. It was December, and it was quite cold outside. I was about to get up and turn on the thermostat when she asked, "How did we get to this point?" This moment made me believe in telepathy. I looked at her and understood. "I don't know," I answered. "How did we get to this point?" I sat down again, and we started talking. The next weekend, I was in a new apartment. He watched the moon emerge from behind the night clouds to gild the river with strange shadows, and remembered how the leaping flames from hell had turned the riverbank into a portrait of hell. "I'm afraid it's not as dramatic as your stories. We just realized we had taken a wrong turn, and continuing down this road would only take us further from where we needed to be. You never got married a second time. You're not a monk, are you?" He smiled at her. "No, I'm not a monk. I am currently single. I've never met anyone I really wanted to marry, but I still believe in women, love, and hope. But you are alone, just like me, and yet around us people copulate and their children sleep in neighboring beds. What did we do wrong?" He covered her hand again with his on the steering wheel. "Nothing. It's just the lottery of life. Some people win, some don't. Sometimes it seems to me that I am being punished. For what? What terrible dark secrets are you still hiding? Don't you think I have terrible secrets? Honestly, with what I've learned, I find it hard to believe. Appearances can be deceiving." Words poured out of her. "He'll never show up here, Johnny." Buster Snow grabbed one of Jesse's mother's famous cakes, popped it in his mouth, and said, "He's coming here. I have $50. When her mother poked her head out of the kitchen and smiled at the black guy who had made his reputation as a protector by protecting her daughter's boyfriend from attacking opponents, Buster waved his hand and said, "Longmire, you should give my mom the recipe for this. She told me to ask you for it." Mildred Longmire bowed slightly to him and said, "Your mother knows that this secret will go with me to the grave, just as her pumpkin pie recipe will be buried next to her. When she's ready to change, let her call me. Anyway, Jessica, all this nonsense aside, why aren't you getting ready to leave for prom? It starts in 45 minutes, and it will take you 30 minutes to get to Azalea Gardens." Jessica Longmire looked at her mother and forced a smile. She would never, ever be able to tell her why they were waiting here. Johnny, Buster, 4 of their teammates, and all of their suitors were waiting to see the punchline of the joke, but they had to leave soon no matter what. "Johnny just wants to be fashionably late when we come in, Mom. You know how vain he is. He thinks that all the girls will pine for him." You know that there is not a single bone of vanity in my body, he said out loud to his friend's mother. She told him, he won't come. I knew he wouldn't do it. Nobody can be that stupid. He had to know that I was joking, teasing him when I told him that we had a fight and that I wanted to go to the prom with the smartest boy in school. Johnny stood up to his impressive 6'4" in height, his eyes already a little glazed over from the alcohol he had consumed over the previous 4 hours, and said, "He thinks he's so smart, and he's so in love with you. I sometimes watch him when you're around. He can't take his eyes off you. He's a pervert." At first it seemed stupid. They were making lists of all the losers when someone mentioned Kenny Bishop's name. It wasn't just that he was short, with a mottled complexion that never cleared up, didn't play sports or hang out with nerds, and wore those damn thick glasses. Or maybe that's how it was. But for her, it was not like that. Johnny was right. Kenny looked at her. Sometimes, when he did not realize that she saw him in the mirror or in the powder compact, she would look up and see that he was looking at her. The hunger in his eyes made her cringe slightly. She's seen that look on a lot of guys since she started developing. But most guys, even the shy ones, ended up doing something. They tried to talk to her, or buy her lunch at school when she didn't have enough money, or volunteer to help with her studies. But not Kenny. He was just hanging out there, in the distance, watching. There was a time when she really started to get nervous that he was one of the crazy ones. That one night she would come home late from a date, and he would be standing in the dark waiting for her, knife in hand, just like in all the horror movies. Eventually, she realized that he just didn't give off that kind of vibe. Even though he was a loner, there were people who knew him. They knew about his damaged home life and his father who beat his mother until she kicked him out. They knew that he accompanied the fat girl who sometimes limped home from school and made her laugh. People joked about them for a while until she found a fat college freshman in St. John's, and suddenly she wasn't alone anymore. But Kenny was there. He wasn't crazy. He was just a loser. A scared, cowardly loser who would stare at her but never open his mouth. Why this bothered her, she couldn't explain even to herself, but it did. Then the doorbell rang, and Caroline, standing at the window, gasped and said, "He's here." She found herself drawn to the window with the morbid fascination of a man watching the terrible fall of a head from a scaffold, not wanting to see, but unable to stop. "Who is this?" called her mother. "Nobody. Just someone else going to prom." She opened the door. He stood on her porch, wearing a terrible tuxedo that looked like something out of an old movie. His unruly hair was combed back. The pimples that made all the girls laugh when he walked through the halls of high school stood out like a relief map of a volcanic zone. His eyes sparkled behind thick glasses. "Hello, Jessica." It seemed to her that his voice really broke, but then she saw in his hand, which he held out to her, oh God, a small bouquet of flowers, which he intended to pin to her dress. He was the laughingstock of 1985 high school, and he brought her a bouquet as if he really thought she would go with him. "What are you doing here?" For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if he did not understand the words. I'm not late. I know we have time. I borrowed my mother's car." He pointed to a 1977 van parked in front of her house. "I mean, Kenny, what are you doing here? I'm getting ready to go to graduation." "I know. We have time." He didn't understand. He simply refused to play the game, then realized that he had been humiliated and slipped away, allowing her to avoid it. "I'm getting ready for prom, Kenny, with my boyfriend. What are you doing here?" Johnny stood in the doorway behind her. "Yes, Kenny, what are you doing here? Why aren't you at home? My girlfriend and I are already leaving." He looked from one to the other and then saw the others standing behind them. "But you said you broke up with him. You invited me to your prom." "It was a joke," Johnny thundered. "It made you look like a fool, you idiot, which wasn't hard at all." Their friends tried their best to keep her mom away from the door, while a pimply loser in a funny tuxedo lay on his back and looked at her, asking, "Why? Why did you do that? For what?" She couldn't understand the anger that suddenly rose within her as she stepped forward. "What makes you think that I would ever, in this world or any other, if you are the last person on earth, ever even think about letting you touch me? Will anyone else see me riding with you, dance with you? Did you really think that I would let someone laugh at me the way everyone laughs at you? You're a joke. You've been a laughing stock for as long as anyone has known you. Nobody likes you, and yet you continue to crawl around and stare at me with your little mouse eyes. I want to take a hot shower every day when I get home from school to get rid of the feeling of you." He gave her a look that she would never forget and ran to his mother's van, then got in and drove away with the sound of their laughter behind him. "That's it, coward, run away," Johnny shouted. "You bastard, run home to mommy." Jessica's mother pushed through the crowd and watched Kenny's car pull away from the curb. "What's going on here, Jessica? And what kind of language is this, Johnny Miller?" He reassured her by saying, "It was Kenny Bishop. He's the weirdo who goes to school. He always had this weird crush on Jess, and he really thought she was going to leave me to go to prom with him. I had to convince him that she would come with me. He didn't take it too well. And yet, somehow, it didn't feel right." That morning, after Johnny brought her home, and she exchanged embarrassed yet proud glances with her mother and father, she showered, changed into a skirt and blouse, and took her mother's car. She knew where Kenny Bishop lived and parked in the driveway. She sat motionless for 10 minutes, again mentally seeing the expression on his face. It wasn't fair. It was damn unfair. It was a joke that any other person would have thought was a cruel joke and just walked away from it. Then she could forget about it and go out with her future husband and friends to enjoy the best night of her life. Finally, she forced herself out of the car and walked to the front door of a simple 2-bedroom house in West Putnam. The van was parked in the driveway and there was not a sound coming from the house. She forced herself to knock and knock again and again and again. Finally, the door opened and the tired woman who she knew was Kenny's mother stood there, looking at her and not saying a word. "Is Kenny here? Can I talk to him?" "No. No. He is not here. Or can't I talk to him?" "No, both times." She turned to leave. "Mrs. Bishop, I need to talk to Kenny." "Why? Yesterday you said everything you needed to say." "You are wrong." Then the elderly woman stopped and looked at her. "I talked to him yesterday, but I didn't tell him everything I needed to say. He told me, you may or may not know that he has been in love with you for many years, and when he told me that you invited him to the ball, I replied that you were just playing with him. Girls like you don't mess with guys like Kenny. Good, kind, loving boys. You prefer loud ones like Johnny Miller. The kind that gets you pregnant and then sees someone else they'd rather be with. Younger, prettier, and with better breasts. If you were smart, you would understand what a good person is. But people like you never do this. Just like me at your age." The two women looked at each other across the generation gap. "Mrs. Bishop, I need to talk to Kenny. I didn't want to hurt him like that. But you did it, and you can't talk to him because he's gone." "Gone? Where?" "It's none of your business. Where you can't hurt him anymore. Where he can recover from what you did. Where he can forget about your existence. I guess in a way I always thought that when things started going bad, it was God's way of punishing me. I destroyed a boy whose only sin was to fall in love with me. It's like the old saying, time heals all wounds." Kincaid looked at her with a strange expression on his face. "It's not a mortal sin, Jessie. You may have broken his heart, but that happens to a lot of guys. They usually survive." She smiled sadly at him. "I often go to church. You probably know this. I heard a lot of sermons and thought a lot about what I did. I was guilty of a great sin that led to the fall of Lucifer in heaven." At these words, she noticed how a smile appeared on his face. "Aren't you in rare company? Are you in the league of Lucifer who rebelled against God?" I see that you are not a real Bible scholar, Mr. Kincaid. Lucifer's great sin was the sin of pride. He could not accept that God was his master, that there was someone greater than him. And how does this apply to you? My pride was insulted that this short, boring guy dared to glance at me, to dream that he might be worthy of my love and affection. He should have known that I was too good for him, but he didn't. So I punished him for trying to rise above his station. That's why I was so angry with him that day. He really hoped to win me over. Trying to rise above your position. I don't think I've ever heard anyone, at least in this country, use that expression. Don't make me feel like more crap than I already feel. It took me a long time to understand what happened and why I went along with Johnny and the others in this prank, other than the fact that I was an arrogant teenage beauty who had no sense in her head. She looked back at the river and the sky above, where the clouds moved to reveal the stars in the darkness. That's why when I counsel these young teenagers who have their heads in their ass, I don't become any more holy than them. I've been where they are and done worse than them. They can all change. As are you. I like to think so. I like to think that if I ever run into Kenny again, I can apologize and he will accept my apology. You still couldn't find him? He dropped out of school before he officially graduated. He took all his end-of-year exams and passed, so he didn't have to go back. I went back to his mother again, but she never spoke to me again. The next year she also left, and no one heard from her again. Several of his friends said they didn't know where she went. They may have lied, but they never spoke to me again. Everyone knew what I did. So you gave up? She shook her head. No, not at all. I told them that I would like to talk to him if anyone ever heard about him, but I couldn't do more. It got to the point where Johnny then felt ashamed, but he will never admit that we were wrong. He insisted until his death that it was Kenny's fault for his stupidity and that any man would have stayed and fought for me if he had fallen in love with me so much. So after a while, I felt like I was betraying Johnny. When I was looking for Kenny, I told Johnny that he was an asshole, that in fact it was all his fault because he started it all. I really loved him. Johnny had changed. I was biased because I loved him, but I know he has improved. He just could never admit that he felt guilty about what happened. Johnny was here in my life, but Kenny was gone. She reached out and covered his hand, which lay on the seat between them, with hers. The worst thing is that I never knew. He could have gone out and killed himself, although I doubted it because someone would have told me. Or he could join the army and die. Or he could move to California, get married, raise 6 children, and become rich. Who knows? She turned on the van's interior lights. I always wondered where he went, where he disappeared, and why he didn't come back. She stared laser-like at the dark-haired man sitting across from her. Where did you run off to, Kenny? And why did you never come back? He smiled. When did you realize this? Just a few seconds ago, but I've had a strange feeling all day. You made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know what it was. But the longer you were around, and I saw you with people, the more I realized that I knew you from somewhere. But it never occurred to me who you really are. This is who I really am. Jesse Robert Kincaid, Times-Union reporter, divorced husband, the former boy of your childhood. How can it be you? Your name has been changed. You look completely different. You're taller. You are no longer the same. You're acting differently. When Jimmy showed up and could have beaten up poor Hubie, or when I went out to talk to Jimmy, you could have run away, but you stood your ground. Kenny wouldn't do that. He didn't do that. He took the hand she had placed on his, raised it to his face, and ran it over his face like a blind woman, seeing the face of another. My name is Kenneth Robert Kincaid, formerly Kenneth Robert Bishop. I moved to Sacramento to live with my uncle, my mother's brother Dave. Mom moved there the next year, and a couple of years later, while I was in college, she met and married Lawrence Kincaid. He was a really nice guy, and I liked him. So when he was dying of cancer a few years later, he asked me to take his name so it wouldn't disappear from the face of the earth. I became Kenneth Robert Kincaid, but now my name is Robert. The smile turned into a smirk. You are 5 or 6. I was 5 or 7. Compared to Johnny, I just seem short. I grew another 5 inches in college. So, 6 feet and my face. It looked pretty bad, but you'd be surprised what dermatologists can do for acne today. I had to pay for a small operation, but I got a normal face, and I wear contact lenses. I still have reading glasses, but when I'm in public, I use contact lenses. She removed her hand from his face and bit her bottom lip. You must have been laughing hysterically inside all day. The ugly duckling turned swan returns to enjoy a personal little prank on yesterday's golden girl. I'm not so golden anymore, right? When were you going to unleash this on me? Were you going to wait until you were ready to leave tonight to tell me? Or were you just planning on leaving again? Leave me in the dark and let me live the rest of my life without knowing the truth. Let me live with guilt for the rest of my life. No master plan, Jesse. I didn't know who you were. I haven't known anything about your life since I left. The truth is, I never wanted to know. I forgot you, but the memories still burn. It was a wild coincidence that we met at all. I should never have done the lady in a wheelchair story. A guy called Harry Bass was appointed, a really good but a bit of an odd reporter. But another reporter, our chief police reporter, Carl Cameron, decided a week ago to marry the woman he loved. She's an assistant state's attorney in Jax, and they were together for over a year, and then they broke up because Carl and his lady were incredibly stupid. But in the end, they wised up and tied the knot. He was ready to give up the honeymoon, but he told his bosses that he was taking this weekend off to be with his new bride, and if they didn't like it, they could fire him. I know you've seen his name. He's a damn good police reporter, but an even better writer. Some of his stories have gone global. They weren't going to fire him on the weekend, and Harry had always been the #2 police reporter, so they made him take Carl's job on the weekend, and I'm stuck with Harry's task. Robert Kenneth reached out and ran his thumb along her jawline. That's why I knew it was fate, that it had to be this way, when I left the church and you turned around in your chair. I didn't know anything about you. I didn't know Johnny died. When I heard that name, I thought you were still married and probably had a bunch of kids, now teenagers, running around. I stayed for the story and because I was curious. Why didn't you just spit in my eyes, turn around and go back, and tell your bosses that someone else should do the story? He shook his head slightly. Because good reporters don't do that. You take whatever story you're given and you finish it. You never stop telling a story. And because I don't hate you, Jesse. Why not? He held out his hand to her, palm up, clenched it into a fist, and gave her a thumbs up. First of all, because it wasn't the end of the world, Jesse. It was a mean thing to do, but I've seen a lot of worse things since I left town. It hurt a lot of pain when I left town, but by the time I was 19 and in Sacramento, I had grown 3 inches and gotten contact lenses, and a lot of my pimples had disappeared. More importantly, I slept with a girl, and more than one. He raised his index finger. Secondly, 20 years have passed. No matter how much it hurts me, no one stays angry for 20 years, unless they're psychopaths. Thirdly, because I was not a saint. After I left Florida and went to California school and learned how to talk to girls, I slept with women I didn't want to see anymore and then disappeared, didn't answer their calls, avoided them until they gave up. I'm not going to apologize for what I did. Fourthly, because you should know it. You're still a beautiful woman, but if you were the bitch I once thought you were, I would have made my story rather than push you to lunch and walked away with you, not knowing anything different. But you are no longer the same girl you were. It's like I'm not the same guy anymore. You said that time heals all wounds. That's damn true. Finally, Jessica Longmire, I owe you. You owe me? I don't understand. Kenny Bishop probably wouldn't stand up to Jimmy in church. Kenny would think about it until it was too late to do anything. Or he would walk away and tell himself that this is not his fight. That day, I told myself there was no point in even talking to you because you had Johnny and you would never look twice at me. I gave up without even trying. My Uncle Dave was in Vietnam twice in the late 60s. He lost his arm in Khe Sanh in 1968. He was a Marine. About 2 months after I arrived in Sacramento, he took me on a bar crawl and we met a pretty girl at a bar. There were two big guys who kept their eyes on her, and when my uncle started interfering with their activities, they got very angry. They warned my uncle to get out, and he hurt them. I later found out that the girl was the girlfriend of one of the guys and was just using us to make him jealous. I asked him as we left the emergency room at 4 a.m. why he almost died fighting for a woman he had never slept with. He sat down on one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs they have in waiting rooms and told me something I will never forget. "You never run away, Kenny," he said. "Whether it's 1,000 Vietnamese or two big jerks in a bar, you never run away, whether you're a Marine or just a man. You stand and fight. What if you lose or get killed? Then you will lose or die. But there are things worse than death, worse than losing. Not trying, not fighting, when you know you have to fight, is even worse. Because if you're alive, you know you did the right thing. And if you die, you won't have anything to worry about. But if you run away, you'll have to live with it for the rest of your life." That's how he lived his life. A couple of years later, he was killed when he tried to come to the aid of an old lady who was fighting with a robber over a purse containing $24. See, they never found the robber, but I know that if my uncle ever came back, he would tell me that he didn't mind the way things turned out. Since then, I haven't run away from anything. Guys, women, or trouble, I face this head on, and I know I am because I ran away from you to Sacramento and met Uncle Dave. If it weren't for you, I don't know who or where I would be today. Robert Kincaid sat up straight in the van. It was 20 years ago, Jesse. We were different people. I'm glad everything worked out and we met today. I thought about you, sometimes, over the years. I couldn't help it. I can't say you really had a great life, but you lived a good life. You are better than I ever thought. I knew you were the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, but I didn't know you were a good person on the inside. Thank you, Kincaid. I mean, really thank you. You don't know what this means to me. You have no idea how many hours I spent regretting what I did. Now knowing that I didn't ruin your life is the best gift I've ever been given. My pleasure. They sat in silence, interrupted by quiet moans, screams, and exclamations. So, I think this is the point where we end the interview and the conversation, and you go back to Jacksonville to do what you do on Sunday and get ready for my story, and I go to church service tomorrow and go back to my own life. Is this what you want, Jesse? What I want to do is to kneel at tomorrow's service, thank God for His mercy, and apologize for doubting His wisdom and glory. I spent all these years feeling guilty and heavy in my heart and asking God how He could let me destroy you. I forgot that God has His own plans and purposes, and we can never truly see His purposes. What happened many years ago led us to this night. I know you may not be religious or a believer, but to me this can't be anything other than the fulfillment of God's plan. How else to explain the chain of events that brought you here today? My discovery of Martha, my ceiling collapsing on the one night you were there to save me. Coincidence? That happens. People get married and their responsibilities change. People are dying. The ceilings are falling. But, he said, I didn't ask what you were going to do tomorrow. She looked at him curiously. I mean, Kincaid said, lifting her hand from the seat and clasping it in his, what do you really want to do tonight? She looked deep into his eyes and then turned off the inner light. It was easier to talk to him in the dark. Are you talking about what I'm thinking about? Didn't you say you owed me? She simply looked at his familiar, unfamiliar features outlined in the ghostly light of the moon. I cannot believe it. I said I've changed. Jesse, I'm not that scared little boy who ran away from you 20 years ago with his tail between his legs. She licked her suddenly dry lips. I know you're not the same anymore. But he sat closer to her, and she could smell his sweat. He didn't shower, but he used deodorant. It wasn't a bad smell. It was a masculine scent. And at that moment, everything changed between them. If you really think that you don't owe me anything, if what you did hasn't weighed on your conscience all these years, then take me back to my car, and we'll go our separate ways. She wanted to say, why couldn't you remain the way you were all day? Minute by minute, I fell in love with you. You wouldn't have to do this. I would give myself to you if I never knew who you were. You didn't have to blackmail me. Besides, the boy that Kenny was would never do that. I can't believe it, but he was a better man than you. But what she said out loud to the man who was Kenny Bishop felt like surrender and goodbye. If that's what you want, Kincaid, then you're right. I owe you. Now I will take you to my place. He slid back onto his side of the seat and said, do it. As she pulled out of the parking lot, instead of turning back toward the city, he told her, turn right, and she crossed the bridge onto the east side of town. She had no idea what he was doing, and she didn't want to talk to him. Maybe it was the booze. Once they reached 17th Street, they passed the closed farmers market and the still open but mostly deserted highway patrol station that patrolled this part of Northeast Florida. Then, as they approached the flashing lights of the two-story Dewdrop Hotel, he said, stop here. It was crowded because Dewdrop was always popular on Fridays and Saturdays. There were a couple of pool tables, cards, and other gambling tables in the back of the building. But the cops on the second floor ignored them. Sandwiches were served until dawn, and couples met on the dance floor. Why are we here? Just come in and hold your questions, Jesse. Like you said, you owe me. She wondered how she could have been so wrong. She rolled up behind him, and while he had to pat on the shoulders and maneuver, as soon as the first couple of people saw her in the chair, the crowd melted and a path appeared to a table at the edge of the dance floor. The wave brought a waitress who had been talked out of leaving her pregnancy with a little boy whose name was now tattooed on her left arm. Miss Jessie convinced her to take the plunge into the unknown and keep the baby, even though she had no idea how she would care for it. Diana stood in front of Miss Jessie and the stranger in her almost non-existent costume and said, what can I get for you and your friend? Get me a Bloody Mary and a rum and coke for Miss Jessie, Kincaid said. Do you mind, Miss Jessie? When she nodded and Kincaid reached for his wallet, she simply shook her head and said, don't. After the waitress left, Kincaid reached out to whisper over the loud music and chatter, don't run off with anyone until I get back. I have something to do. And he disappeared. For a moment she thought about turning around, going outside and going back home. Let Kincaid find his own way home. Let him be angry. Let him make her look bad. She couldn't feel worse than she did now. It wasn't like he was asking her to do anything she hadn't done many times before. And he was an attractive man. And even earlier, she felt a surge of desire. But he was destroying the image of who she thought he had become. She was sipping a Coca-Cola with 4 cherries when he returned to the table and sat down. The buzz grew louder as the live band returned to the stage. I don't know what we're doing here, Kincaid. If you want to enjoy the fantasy of dating me, why bother? In a few minutes, you will get everything you want. Why worry about it? Let's just get this over with. Why don't you have a drink and listen to music? Then we'll go. The band, Shades of Night, was a 6-piece with 2 guitars, a keyboard player, a drummer, and a tall blonde singer who was already causing fights between guys. After a few minutes, the crowd began to calm down, and a singer named White Lightning leaned into the microphone and said, if the girls want to go home with the band tonight, raise your hands. There were dozens of hands and good-natured whistles. Just kidding, guys, we're all married here. Kinda sometimes. Anyway, we were going to start with something classic from Lynyrd Skynyrd. But tonight we have a special request, and I hope that you will allow us to play these 2 songs before we go back to our usual things. He turned to his group and said, let's begin. As the band moved into the first song, Jesse could tell that many of the younger people had no idea what it was, but the older ones knew and began to move in their seats as Take On Me began. Kincaid stood up and extended his hand. "Can I have this dance?" "What?" "I agreed for the group to play several songs of our time. Can I invite you to this dance?" She looked from him to the orchestra, to the guests who were sitting or standing in their chairs, but did not move to the dance floor. "What? I can't." "You said you owe me, Jesse. 20 years ago, we didn't have a single dance." "No. I thought you were a woman of your word. One dance tonight, maybe two, and your debt will be paid." "I can't, not like this." She pointed to the wheelchair she was sitting in. "It didn't stop you from doing everything you wanted. You can do it. Besides, people are waiting for you to hit the dance floor." The eyes were focused on her. The waitress she had persuaded to leave her son stared at her with tears in her eyes and motioned for her to join the dance floor. She rolled across the dance floor, Kenny Robert Kincaid holding her lightly by the shoulders, and they seemed to sway on the floor without a chair between them. It was so light that it seemed like just a dream. They danced to "I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight" and "Can You Tell Me What Love Is?" and half a dozen other oldies that couples young and old found reason enough to embrace each other on the dance floor. Finally, the music stopped and White Lightning said, "Many people you don't know appreciate everything you've done for so many years. I'm glad your friend brought you here today." Robert Kincaid leaned over and kissed her. Out of the corner of her eye, Jessie noticed that the waitress Diana was crying. "I thought so." "What did you think, Jessie?" They sat in the driveway, the garage door still down. "You know what I thought. Bastard. You could have told me. It was petty of me. I know. But I'm only human. I wanted to hurt you, just a little bit. And I can't help it if your thoughts are dirty." "Did I already tell you that you're a bastard?" "Several times today." "You know, you could kiss me again." "I know." "So why?" "You owed me this dance. It seemed like it was what we both needed. If anything else happens, I don't want it to happen between Jessica Longmire and Kenny Bishop. I want it to be between Miss Jessie Lady in a wheelchair and Robert Kincaid. I'll give you time to think about what you want rather than coming at you when you're emotionally knocked down and still in shock. So you and Kenny aren't so different after all. Neither of you will reach out to grab what you really want." He looked at her without a smile, but his words sounded soft. "I haven't decided if I want this yet, Jessie. A lot of time has passed, and we have both changed a lot. Sometimes there are things you should leave alone. Just let me think. A lot happened to me today, too. You're not the only one whose world has been rocked." She looked at him silently. "You're right, Kincaid. Maybe we both need time. Now you can leave. I can get inside myself. I will go with you." She closed the garage behind her, and he followed her into the kitchen, where he put down the new six-pack of Bud Lights he'd bought, explaining why he had to do it. Jessie thought that's what Robert Kincaid would do. He then followed her into the office and stood there as she pressed the button on the key fob, and the front door clicked and swung open. "Thank you, Kincaid. I will never forget this day." He leaned over and kissed her. "I'll call you next Friday or Saturday. I don't know my schedule, but I hope you can save me some time on your schedule. I want to take you on a real date. Dinner somewhere that serves more than just hamburgers, and dancing in a good place. It will be between Robert Kincaid and Jessie Miller. The Times Union has nothing to do with it. I hope you'll agree to come with me. I thought you needed time to decide if you wanted this. I took as much time as I needed. I won't leave you a second time. Call me and we'll see. Are you playing hard to reach? I'm starting to feel like I'm 17 again." As the lights of his Subaru disappeared down the driveway, she watched them for a moment. She took a deep breath. What a day. You live for years and things go on, and then one day your world turns upside down. She turned around and looked at the room in front of her. Was she always this miserable? So old? Is this loneliness? Maybe. She just stopped noticing it because it didn't matter. It was just a place where she sometimes slept and cooked food. She looked back down the driveway. Now it was empty. Robert Kincaid Kinney Bishop. In 20 years. She had dreamed that one day this would happen, but now that it had become a reality, everything was not at all what she had imagined. The reality was different. She closed the door, locked it, and turned on the alarm. She turned and moved in her chair towards the bedroom. Will he call her? Most likely not. People weren't that holy. No matter what he said, she could see the pain in his eyes that day. Can someone rise above the urge to hurt back, lift the spirits of a lonely middle-aged woman, and then just ignore her? Let her feel the same rejection he felt. Like she said, time heals all wounds. And she deserved it. If he decided to raise her hopes and then destroy them, then this was just what she expected. And maybe it will make a big difference for the balance. And maybe she can forgive herself and forget Robert Kincaid. She turned the chair around and slid onto the bed with practiced ease. Lying in the dark after she turned off the light, she thought, what if he wasn't lying? What if he forgave her? What if he really wants to see her again? What if he was on the other end of the line when the phone rang? She couldn't bring herself to believe it. But what if? She smiled into the darkness. Next week promised to be interesting. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.